Hi, my name is Sarah McGinnis, and you're watching the first of 4 videos sponsored by Church Beyond called Exploring Your Prayer Life. So the first thing I want you to notice about these videos is that they're going to be kind of laid back and they're going to be pretty informal. I'm sitting on my couch in my house, and I chose this spot because this is the spot I come to every morning as part of my my prayer practice and my discipline. This is the spot I come to on this couch or on my dining room table. And so I thought it'd be fun that if I'm going to sit and talk to people about prayer, that it'd be fun to do it in the spot where I spend the most time in prayer. So this will be very, very casual and informal. I have my computer here next to me with notes on it. So if you see me looking down or around, that's what I'm doing. But doing my best to have these videos kind of feel like what it's like when I do workshops like this in person. So this is the first of 4 videos. This video is just an introductory. So we're going to be going over 3 different prayer practices, learning maybe ones for the first time, or maybe there'll be ones that you're revisiting, they'll be familiar. But the 3 practices that we're going to explore over these videos will first be Lectio Divina, which is a way of praying through scripture. And then we will be doing the Ignatian Examen, which is a forum of examining kind of your mind and your conscience. And then finally, we're going to look at centering prayer. So those are the 3 prayer practices that this video series will cover. We won't go into any of those in depth in this video. So this video will just be to lay some groundwork, to give an overview of the series, allow you to get familiar with me a little bit, and to lay some own groundwork for yourself as you start this exploration. So one thing you'll notice as you go through this series, that each of these practices requires similar things from you. So each is going to require silence. It's going to require stillness and solitude. And I think those are really important things to bring into our lives. And so that's one of the things I love best about these prayer practices is what it requires of you. Because we live in a world that is chaotic and is busy, and we constantly have information and words and images just flooding into our minds and coming out of us. And so practices that really require you to be quiet, to quiet your body with stillness, to kind of cease movement in a way, and then to quiet your mind, to quiet your heart. And when I say solitude, I don't necessarily mean that you have to be alone, although that definitely can be part of it. These prayer practices can be done in groups or they can be done individually. But for me, solitude it is really defined as kind of this looking inward, not focusing on the people around you, not focusing on external things, but really looking inward. For me, that's what solitude is finding God within you, and not always looking outside of you, although you can find God there too. So silence, stillness, and solitude. These are going to be three really just foundational aspects of these prayer practices, and something that hopefully you'll experience throughout this series. So these videos are set up for you to be able to do them individually. So maybe you are sitting and watching this video on your couch, or maybe in your bed, or maybe you're sitting with a group of people in a room at your church, or maybe at someone's home in their living room. And both of those are great. These videos are designed for you to be able to do either one. Each video will have reflection questions that will be offered as a way for you just to kind of process through some of the things that you're learning and exploring. So if you're doing it with a group, you can use those reflection questions as discussion prompts, and I really encourage you to do that. If you're doing this video or these videos individually, maybe use the reflection questions as a way to journal, journaling prompts, if that's helpful for you. Maybe just to sit and meditate on them and just reflect inwardly and in your head. But if you are doing it individually, I would encourage you to throughout the series to find a friend that you can just have some conversations with about what you're learning and what you're exploring. That can be very helpful just to reflect conversationally with someone. So a trusted friend that you would like to just be able to sit and talk with some of these things with. I think that would be helpful. Also, with these videos, the intention really would be for you to watch a video and then to take a week before you start the next video. The idea being that when you're introduced to a new practice, these practices are meant to be used on a daily basis or consistently. I would suggest a daily basis. And so the encouragement would be to watch a video, to learn about this prayer practice, and then to give it a week of your attention in a daily format before watching the next video, moving on to the next practice. That way you're really giving it a chance to sink in. One of the things I find so helpful about daily practices is that you really get to get a sense of what your rhythms of life are. So one day you might sit down to do a prayer practice, and it's really refreshing. It's really renewing. It felt fruitful and it felt productive. But then maybe the next day it feels like just nothing happened at all. And when you do a practice daily, you find that that's normal. It's normal to have days where your practice feels fruitful and beneficial, and it is normal to have days when it just feels like it falls flat. And that's a normal rhythm. That's a normal pattern of life. And sometimes you don't get that sense of that rhythm when you don't do a practice on a daily basis. So this first introductory video will have some homework with it. It doesn't have a specific prayer practice attached to it, but it will have a homework or a soul work or prayer work practice that I want you to do for the next week before you start the next one. Now, clearly you can just disregard my suggestion and watch all these videos at once if you want, but they are designed for you to take a week between each video. When I've done prayer workshops before, I've entitled them Improving Your Prayer Life, and I didn't want to call this video series Improving Your Prayer Life because I've started to feel like improving is like almost like a guarantee that these practices can do something, that they can improve your spiritual life, improve your prayer life, and really the practices in and of themselves cannot do that. They don't have that type of power. Instead, I wanted to call it Exploring Your Prayer Life, because I think that actually the thing that improves your spiritual life, that improves your prayer life, is not the practice itself, but the intention and the act of curiosity and the sense of adventure in your spiritual life, of trying something new, of continuing to seek God in new ways, to revisit even old ways, but to just continually seek and to live into this spirit of curiosity with your spiritual life. I think that just the intention of that is what is going to be beneficial and what is going to affect your prayer life and your spiritual life and your connection to God. So exploring your prayer life is what we're going to call this, because that's what we're doing. We're just being curious, and we're following our curiosity, and we're seeing where God meets us along the way as we do that. Because prayer practices in and of themselves, they are not magic. They will not always lead you to a mountaintop experience, and that should never be our expectation of a prayer practice. Seeking God, meeting God, being in the presence of God, that's our goal. And that's not always going to feel like a mountaintop experience. So I really want you to just trust the natural rhythm of the spiritual life, and the way that it builds, and the way that it ebbs and flows. So before we go on, I want to start off with laying a little groundwork, and try to attempt a definition at the obvious of what is prayer. Prayer can be defined in many different ways, and it's shaded a little differently just based on the person that you ask and the experience they've had, and how they approach prayer and what they believe prayer to be. So in just a moment, I want you to pause this video and I want you to answer these questions for yourself. So if you're doing this video individually, maybe take some time to write down your answer to these questions. And if you're in a group, take some time to reflect on the questions and then share with the group. So these are the questions that I want you to think about. So thinking about your own life and experience with prayer, how would you define prayer? What has it meant for you in your life? What do you consider prayer? What are maybe some of the requirements you put on it to make it prayer, technically prayer for you? So just think about that. Think about how is it that you pray? When do you pray? Why do you pray? Think about all these types of things. Take a few minutes and just think about your answer to these questions, and then I'll see you back here when you unpause the video. Okay, well, welcome back. I hope you've had some good time to reflect on what prayer has been for your life. When I've posed this question to people before in workshops or in conversations, I wanted to share with you some of the answers I've been given, especially if you are doing this video individually. I just want you to be able to hear maybe how some other people conceptualize and define prayer. So I'm just going to read through a couple of different definitions that I found from people. Prayer is a conversation with God, talking and listening. Prayer is intentionally being with God. Prayer is being attentive. Prayer is listening with every facet of my being and allowing my mind to notice love and beauty and being grateful. I think those are some really beautiful definitions of prayer, and I think every single one of them is true. For me, growing up, my definition of prayer was consistently pretty narrow, and I had a lot of anxiety around prayer and whether or not I was doing it right. It never felt like this thing that was as beautiful as some of those descriptions of prayer. That just wasn't my experience. A lot of times for me, it felt kind of lackluster and boring. And I put a lot of like rigid boundaries on what it needed to be and what it needed to look like based on, I guess, what I saw other people doing or how I heard it described to me growing up. So for me, prayer had to be this thing that you did at like a set time of day. So for me, it was like either in my bed at night before going to sleep or in my car driving somewhere, and it had to be, you know, these words I was saying, like this, maybe this list of worries or concerns, and, you know, and it was a conversation with God, but a lot of times I just like felt guilty about maybe the way I was praying, or I wasn't praying for other people enough, or I wasn't praying with the right attitude or the right heart, and so it was always just kind of anxiety-ridden thing, and there were lots of times in my life where I just didn't attempt anything. And it wasn't until I was an adult and I was in college that I started reading some writings by people like Thomas Merton, that my conceptualization of prayer started to broaden a little bit. There are going to be several books that I want to introduce you to throughout this series. And a couple of them will be a couple of books by Thomas Merton. And so there's one book that I was reading in that I wanted to share with you this quote on how Thomas Merton talks about prayer. Prayer is not so much a way to find God as a way of resting in Him whom we have found, who loves us, who is near to us, who comes to us to draw us to Himself. So that's a very different understanding of prayer than what I gave myself growing up. In Merton's kind of conceptualization of prayer, it is not so much about a posture that you sit in, or certain words that you say, or a certain time of day that you pray, or a certain place that you go to pray. It really has more to do with resting and releasing yourself to the presence of God. And when I think about prayer as resting in the presence of God, my idea of what prayer looks like is very different. So if I think about what it's like to be in the presence of God, I then see me sitting down and playing my guitar and singing as an act of prayer. When I think about prayer as resting in the presence of God and being in the presence of God, taking a hike out in the woods feels like prayer then. Or I don't know if you've ever been with another person and having a conversation where you can just sense there's something swirling between you that's beyond you. And then that to me feels like resting in the presence of God. And so meaningful conversations with another person can then be, for me, an act of prayer. And so when I started to think about prayer in this much broader sense, this much grander sense than I had ever allowed myself before, the phrase that Paul uses to the Thessalonians, to this encouragement to pray without ceasing, that encouragement made a lot more sense when I began to see prayer as not these set times of days and these set things that you say, but more of this awareness of the presence of God. That allows me to see how life can be a life of prayer, a life where you are praying without ceasing, a life where you are tuning yourself to the awareness of God in every moment of your day. That is a different way of viewing prayer, and that's a way that I hope throughout these videos we can start to have an understanding of prayer, where prayer is not these set practices that we do at times of day, but prayer practices are things that we do, these disciplines that we have that train our hearts and our minds and our bodies to be aware of the presence of God at every moment of our day. So I've started to learn that prayer is more about the heart in which I approach it, the intention that I bring to a practice. And so one of the books that we're going to go over in next week's video is a book by Basil Pennington on Lectio Divina. And in this book, he offers 4 dispositions that are helpful to bring to the practice of Lectio Divina. And we'll go over them again next week when we specifically talk about this prayer practice of Lectio Divina. But I wanted to talk about them in this first introductory video because I think these 4 dispositions that he names don't just apply to this one practice of praying scripture. I think it really applies to any prayer practice or any spiritual practice, spiritual discipline that you have in your life. I think these dispositions that he names are universally applicable to any spiritual practice that you would want to implement in your daily life. So the 4 dispositions he names are faith, openness, humility, and faithfulness. So I want to take some time and work through each of those individually and how they can apply to this exploration of our prayer life that we're attempting over these next few weeks. So the first one he gives is faith. When we come to God in prayer or in a prayer practice, we have to have faith that God is going to be present to us. I find it so compelling that all through the gospel, all these times when Jesus is healing people, he heals them and he says, your faith has healed you. So it's almost like this faith that we have is this thing that gives God's power access into our life, so that God's power, Christ's healing, it's there and it's radiating out towards us, but we have to have faith in order for that power to access within us. That faith is what allows that power to actually move in and through us and do the healing work that God longs to offer us. So faith. As we approach these different practices, as we're learning them, as we're experiencing them, as we're implementing them in our daily life, I want to encourage you to have the faith that God will meet you there, that God will be present, and that God longs to do work in you. God longs to speak to you, and that if you approach these practices with the faith that those things will happen, that you will receive them. Openness is the next disposition I want to talk about. And so openness, we actually have already kind of covered a little bit at the beginning. Openness for me is dedication to this pursuit of curiosity, to consistently open yourself up to new experiences and new ways that God can approach you and work in your life. So it might be for some of you, as we go throughout these videos, we might be going over practices that are familiar to you. Maybe you've done Lectio Divina before. Maybe you've done an examen. Maybe you've done centering prayer. And so the encouragement would be that I think oftentimes when we encounter familiarity, it creates an opening for boredom to come in. And if we let boredom come in, we can get pretty distracted easily. We can get pretty kind of like bogged down with something that might feel repetitive or redundant. And I want to encourage you that if these practices are familiar to you, that you not allow boredom to like kind of edge its foot in the door, because God can speak to you in a new way through an old practice. That's completely possible. The thing that would keep God from working is you closing yourself off just because this is something you've done before. Maybe it hasn't worked for you in the past, or you were really wanting to try something new. Don't allow the discouragement that boredom brings to close you off from fresh ways that God wants to speak to you and work in your life. On the flip side of that, if some of these practices are very new to you, for some people that can cause a bit of discomfort to try new things, and that can actually cause anxiety for people, and that too can close you off to the ways that God is trying to approach you and work in your life. So throughout these practices, do your best to just remain curious, to just ask questions, to just let new things come in, and to not allow maybe familiar things to draw in boredom. Do your best to just remain open and to remain hopeful and faithful that God will work in these ways with you. That as you approach God and you are faithful to approach God, that God will not leave you disappointed. The next disposition is humility. There's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot that we'll never know about God and about the spiritual life and this world that we live in and all the mysteries that it carries. And humility for me is the recognition of that I don't know everything and that I won't know everything. And that there are some things that just are always going to be a mystery to me. And I think so many of the spiritual teachers throughout history have really likened spiritual growth as an unknowing more than a knowing. That the further along you get, the more you realize what you don't know and what you won't know. And that has this miraculous ability to open a person up and to allow for more space and more compassion and more graciousness towards ourselves and towards others. And so when we think we know everything, when we think we can pin down the exact right answer for everything, that actually has the ability to really close ourselves off and to really shoot up walls between us and other people and what we know versus what they know. And I have the truth and they don't have the truth. So humility for me is really this recognition of all that I do not know. And it helps me remain open to God, which is, we've already talked about that openness. It helps me to remain willing to learn. It helps me remember that I am always nothing but a beginner in this life, and that it's not about moving to the next level and the next level and the next level. That it's about growing in humility and growing in what we don't know, and how to use that in our life. And I think it'll be very helpful as we approach these different practices. This recognition that you are a beginner, being led by a beginner, and that we're all just in this together, trucking along, trying to just do our best and be faithful to what God is revealing to us. The last disposition I want to talk about is faithfulness, or we can call this commitment. So all these practices, in order for you to reap any benefits from them, require you to commit to them, to be faithful to the practice, to not give up on them too early. So that's one of the reasons we've designed these videos to go in a weekly format, that you at least give a week of your time to each of these practices before you decide if it's for you or if it's not for you. And you might want to even give it longer than that. But we learn best by doing. And so we can read books, we can listen to sermons, we can go to workshops, we can watch videos, but ultimately we're not going to learn how to pray or how to pray differently without just diving in and doing it. And so the most important aspect of these videos is not me sitting here talking or even you listening to them. It's your participation in the practices and your commitment to giving them your all. For the time that you've set, and being faithful to them each day as you go along. And I believe wholeheartedly that if you commit to showing up fully, that you will not be disappointed. That God will not disappoint one of his children who is working so diligently to show up and to be present to their life and present to God, and to listen intently to what God has to speak to them. So show up and enjoy the ride. All right, so before we close out our time with this first video, here is your homework for the week. So we're going to dive into the different prayer practices starting next week with Lectio Divina. This week, all I want you to do is to observe your prayer life as it currently is. So I want you to take notes about this, maybe jot down some things, think about this each day. And here are some questions to kind of guide you. What times of day are you praying? Where do you go to pray? What are the things that you are praying about? What are the feelings that you are bringing into your prayer time? What are the dispositions you are bringing into your prayer time? And I want you to observe this all very non-judgmentally. We're not looking for you to critique your prayer life this week. All I want you to do is observe it. Just see what it's like. Take some notes about it. When we go on journeys, when we're trying to maybe get to someplace new, it's helpful to take notes about where we are currently. So just spend this week just noticing how you move through your days, when you're finding yourselves in times of prayer, and what it's like. And then maybe, so next week when you come back, if you're in a group, maybe you take some time to share about those observations that you've made. And again, if you're doing this individually, as you're making these observations, sit and chat with them with a friend, and maybe compare and contrast and ask them to do this activity, this exercise with you. I'm really excited about this journey that we're all going to take together, and I'm excited hopefully to maybe hear from some of you on what these practices will be like for you, and what these weeks will hold. So be thinking about your prayer life. Be thinking about these dispositions of faith, of humility, of openness and faithfulness, and how can you bring these dispositions into your daily life and into these practices that we're gonna explore over these next few weeks. So thank you for watching this first video, and I will see you in the next one. Grace and peace.